Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us. Why was D-Day such a pivotal moment in the Second World War?
D-Day was vital because the Western Allies had to have a presence on the continent. Otherwise, the Soviet Union, or possibly still the Nazi Empire, but much more likely the Soviet Union, would completely dominate Europe.
What are the most common myths about D-Day?
There are loads of them. The one I think that is most powerful is that it was all entirely an American operation. Mr. Trump seemed to present that just the other day at the time of the anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and that's not true. The Americans did make up the majority, about 2/3 in fact, but at least 1/3 were made up of the British and the Canadians and a whole host of other countries which gave ships to the gigantic 6,000 ship flotilla. So it's very important to recognise this was an Allied operation and not just an American one.
How close did D-Day come to failing or succeeding?
It could have failed if a couple of things had gone wrong. Firstly, if Adolf Hitler had been woken early enough and had sent as many panzers as he later did to the beaches, that would have been pretty disastrous. It would have gone wrong if more of the parachutists had missed their targets. Quite a few did, but if any more of them had, there was a lot of friendly fire that was very dangerous on the beaches. There was a way in which, had the weather turned nasty, that could have been terrible for the landing craft. You know, it still was, although it was, Eisenhower managed to cut down the risks to the absolute minimum, nonetheless there were still risks.
Can you talk about the planning of D-Day and what happened on the day?
The planning of D-Day had essentially been going on for 2 years. The Western Allies always recognised that there would have to be a cross-channel attack. Winston Churchill actually spoke about going back to the continent as early as the June of 1940. He talked about the Mulberry harbours that needed to be invented and then obviously built. I mean, this had been in the planning for a very long time. General Frederick Morgan had been tasked with it right at the beginning, and you had some of the best brains in the Pentagon and the War Ministry working out exactly how this was going to work, and so it was a triumph really of Anglo-Allied, Anglo-American military planning.
What role did British leadership play, particularly Churchill, in the planning and operations of D-Day?
Well, the British had a very important 2 beaches that they needed to take, and of course the Canadians had Juno Beach also. So it was a geographically quite a wide space. They had to get to Caen as quickly as possible. They didn't succeed in that. Of course, it actually took weeks to capture Caen, but otherwise it was a huge effort for Britain. You remember that Britain is also fighting in Burma. Of course, it's got the Royal Navy all over the world. It had taken a bloody nose in several stages of the North African campaign. It was fighting in Italy. You know, for a small island, we were really stretched to capacity by June 1944, and yet nonetheless we were able to do help pull off one of the great amphibious landings, the greatest amphibious landing in the history of mankind.
Can you talk about Churchill's role in D-Day and maybe give viewers an idea of how cautious he was, perhaps because of Gallipoli, how he didn't want D-Day to happen too early? I know the Americans were trying to push for it to happen earlier. So what was Churchill's role in D-Day?
Another of the great myths of D-Day is that Churchill didn't want it to happen. There are movies about this, appallingly bad movies that have endless mistakes in them. But the myth is that he was so badly psychologically wounded by the disaster of the Gallipoli campaign in the First World War, which had been his brainchild and had turned out to be a complete disaster, leading to the death or wounding of 147,000 men, that he was opposed to it. This is not true. He was interested in the whole planning from June 1940 onwards. He appointed the key people. He always recognised that the only way that the war could be won would be by a cross-channel attack in the West, at the same time, obviously, as the Russians were fighting in the East. And he was instrumental in ensuring that the necessary supplies and troops got to where they needed to be. So, this is a complete myth. And it's surprising still that historians are willing to talk such tripe about it, frankly.
Is it true that the Americans tried to push for an earlier D-Day before 1944?
The Americans wanted to go across as early as the autumn of 1942, when in April 1942 General Marshall and General Eisenhower and others came over to discuss the timing of the cross-channel attack. They were overtly interested in trying to do it essentially 2 years early, when we didn't have air cover, where the P-51 Mustang had not cleared the skies over Normandy. We didn't have the pipeline under the ocean. We didn't have the success, the victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, which means we couldn't have necessarily resupplied if the Germans had fought successfully back in the way, say, that they did, of course, in the August of 1942 in Dieppe. And primarily, we hadn't had the bleeding of the Russian army in Russia. The German army in Russia. So it was an impossibility, really, to have gone that early. And one of the greatest things that Lord Alan Brooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and Winston Churchill did in the Second World War was to ensure that we didn't have an over-hasty return to the Western European continent.
What about the German planning for D-Day? Can you talk a bit about the Atlantic Wall and so on?
The Germans had over 2 million slave labourers working on the Atlantic Wall for 4 years prior. So pretty much this extraordinary series of defences went the whole way along the Western Littoral. However, of course, they didn't know exactly where it was going to be, and some absolutely brilliant intelligence operations led them to believe that it was going to take place at the Pas de Calais. So they spent an enormous amount of time and effort and money and materials and so on protecting against an attack there. They weren't sure whether or not there was going to be an attack in the far north. They had no idea. So they had to cover the entire area, which of course dissipated their supplies.
Why did the Americans struggle so much at Omaha Beach?
Omaha Beach was an incredibly difficult place to capture. I mean, all 5 of the beaches, the Germans put up extremely stiff resistance. But at Omaha, you had a couple of things that went wrong, in that not all the landing craft landed where they should have, where they were needed. And the German defence on that day was extremely tough. It wasn't that something had necessarily something major had gone wrong. It was just the way to look at it really is that we were very fortunate that on the British beaches and at Juneau, so many things went right. I mean, amphibious operations are very famously the most difficult military operations to pull off, and this was one that involved 160,000 men landing on one day.
Montgomery, one of those British generals who was crucial in D-Day's planning and operations, he gets a lot of criticism for his failure to take Caen. You mentioned that earlier. The predictions were that Caen would be taken very quickly, and actually it took a long time. Do you think the criticism of him is fair?
I don't think Montgomery failed at Caen. It was a very difficult nut to crack. Of course, they were supposed to take it in a few days. The Evening Standard actually was published in London saying it had fallen within 2 days. In fact, it took 3 weeks. And there was an awful lot of very hard fighting. It needed to be taken. It was a nodal point as far as transport was concerned. It was hellish for the poor old French civilians who lost their lives in enormous numbers there. But it wasn't, I mean, bad things happen in warfare, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the planning was wrong. There are any number of factors.
Why was Winston Churchill so keen to be on the front lines during the D-Day operations?
Winston Churchill always loved being at the absolute key moment in action. You see this all the way through his life, his time as a war correspondent, the moment in the Sydney Street siege in 1910 when he was Home Secretary. He didn't need to turn up to Sydney Street, but of course there he was watching operations. He was always at the key place at the key time. The Wall Street crash, he was actually in New York. He had this extraordinary ability to be at the key place, and the key place for the 6th of June 1944 was going to be on HMS Belfast. Hopefully he wanted to bring the King along as well, and a lot of effort had to be put into preventing him from doing that. Finally, it was the King, of course, who simply ordered him not to go, but that's completely natural Churchill. You see him crossing the Rhine. You see him actually under the sort of radius of German shell fire up in Italy as well in 1943. He just loved being where the action was.
How well do you think young people know about D-Day, and can you talk about D-Day's legacy today?
I think not enough young people know about D-Day, but that's because our schools don't like to teach the uplifting part of British history for some extraordinary reason. Only 11% of schools teach about Agincourt and Trafalgar and Waterloo. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing considering that 99% of schools teach about the slave trade and any number of other things that we rightly should feel shameful and guilty about. But there are lots of things in British history that we should feel incredibly proud of, and one of them is D-Day.
Some historians argue that D-Day wasn't as important as many people believe, mostly due to the fact that the majority of the fighting happened on the Eastern Front with the Soviet Union, and they were the ones who really defeated the Nazis. What do you make of this revisionism? What do you make of the people who downplay D-Day's importance?
Well, I think the Allied contribution to the Soviet contribution should be remembered. The amount of tanks and aircraft that were shipped over to the Russians, both through Iran, of course, but also mainly through the Murmansk, Archangel, Arctic convoys, was absolutely vital. The fact that we bombed Germany and therefore stopped some 30% of the Luftwaffe from being able to operate against Russia was also an essential feature of that. It's not either or. The point about an alliance is that you overlap in lots of areas, and the Western Allies gave Russia enormous help in the Second World War, which tends to be underplayed by those people who want to argue that it was just the Russians who won the war, which of course you're getting from the ultra-nationalists in Russia at the moment, including especially President Putin. I think it's also worth remembering, of course, though, that for every 5 Germans killed on a battlefield in the Second World War, 4 of them did die on the Eastern Front. So the Russians were killing the majority of Germans, and the rest of the Allies, the Western Allies, were killing the 5th German, essentially. So it's vital to see this whole thing in the round.
Now, you mentioned revisionism and Putin. He is trying to rehabilitate Stalin's image and legacy. They've just put up a statue of him in an underground station in Moscow. Is that right?
I think Stalin was necessary to the victory in the Second World War. He was the person who ultimately, was the head of state. He kept the Russians in the war. He made his private train ready to take him back beyond the Urals on the 18th and 19th of October 1941, but didn't actually get in it and leave. He was pretty terrible when it came to decision making, which is why he quite rightly gave marshals such as Zhukov and Rokossovsky and Konev quite a bit of leeway in their important battles. But the reason that Putin should not be glorifying Stalin in the way that he is and rehabilitating him is not actually to do with the Second World War at all. It's to do with the 6 million plus innocent people who he murdered, innocent civilians who he murdered in the course of his dictatorial communist regime, and the 14,000 Polish officers who he had shot in the Katyn forest in 1940, and the monstrous totalitarianism of Stalin. That in itself should be quite enough to let you know everything you need to know about Putin in his attempted rehabilitation of this man.
Stalin and the Red Army were also incredibly wasteful with human life, as compared to the Allies, the British and the Americans, who had this steel, not flesh policy. Can you compare the two ways of warfare?
Well, they come ultimately down to politics, don't they? If you're running a totalitarian country and you know that you're not going to come under any political pressure whatsoever for huge amounts of people who are dying, then you can fight a much more wasteful kind of war than if you have to stand up in Congress or in Parliament and defend your actions on a regular basis to the often the relatives of the people who've been killed. So it's one of the advantages really of democracy that they fight wars in a way that is not immensely wasteful. The Russians did not need to lose 27 million of their citizens in the Second World War if they'd first of all been much more intelligent with regard to the strategy, the danger of being attacked by Hitler. Stalin was warned on 80 separate occasions that this was going to happen, and he ignored all of them as English provocation. But he also would have these orders, the not a step back orders, where people were essentially ordered to fight to the death, which the Western Allies did very, very rarely indeed, because it tends to be better if you do withdraw and are able to fight again another day.
Can you describe Hitler's day as he woke up on June the 6th and what happened with Rommel, who was the German commander responding to the Allied attacks?
Well, Rommel was in the wrong place because of his wife's birthday. He was in Germany, so he had to dash back, and his car came under attack from an Allied warplane. So that also held him back. Hitler had a late night the night before with a visiting delegation and given orders to his orderly not to be woken up. But the orderly, who didn't recognise that the scale of the invasion was quite as enormous as it was, therefore didn't wake him up, and that allowed crucial hours to be used by the Allies to both get ashore and also consolidate their positions.
Is it right that Hitler...
And there was another problem, of course, which was that Hitler made specific orders that the panzers couldn't be used without his knowledge. He didn't give either Gerd von Rundstedt or Erwin Rommel the right to move the panzers, and those two very senior generals also had overlapping commands, which was a stupid thing to do. You very much needed, as the Allies had, to have a single line of command.
And is it right that Hitler he didn't believe that this was the real D-Day? He thought this was a feint until it was too late.
Hitler had changed his mind. He actually had recognised Normandy as the place that was going to be attacked, and then later changed his mind to think that it was the Pas-de-Calais. there were some, I think probably in the whole of human history it's difficult to think of a more brilliant intelligence operation than the one that led the Germans to think that the attack was going to take place at the Pas-de-Calais. Largely one man who was behind it, invented 27 different aliases for leaving the Abwehr thinking in Berlin that there were 27 different people who all pointed to the Pas-de-Calais. I mean, it's an extraordinary operation, and the man responsible, a Spaniard in fact, called Pujol, is one of the great unsung heroes of the Second World War.
Now, you've talked a bit about Hitler and Stalin's failures as military leaders, but what about Winston Churchill's failures? If you read Alan Brooke's diaries, there are lots of criticisms of Churchill's war leadership skills.
Yes, lots of criticism, and this is the thing. You know, anybody who looks at Winston Churchill objectively recognises that he made mistakes. Of course, he did. He was at the in the House of Commons for 2/3 of a century, dealing with every single major issue. So of course he made mistakes. He made loads of mistakes. We mentioned earlier the Gallipoli campaign, the Black and Tans, the abdication crisis. Female suffrage. There are any number of things that he got wrong, but the things he got right in the Second World War so hugely outweigh the things that he got wrong that it makes me wonder about the people who just solely want to concentrate on the things he got wrong.
We're almost on some criticisms of him, but just sticking with D-Day, final question. What was Churchill's emotional and strategic response to the landings? Obviously he wasn't on the ships himself, but I presume he was watching over things.
Churchill came down on the train and he was at Dover, and he was watching incredibly carefully. Of course, as soon as he knew that the landings had been a success, he was able to go back to London and say so and tell the House of Commons to widespread national rejoicing. So emotionally, he was entirely bound up with the success of the operation. He was very worried about it, even so much as the night before he warned his wife that there might be as many as 20,000 young men, killed and dying in the Channel. Actually, in the end, it was much more like close to 5,000. Still an expensive operation, obviously, but nonetheless, compared to what had been achieved, they were relatively light losses.
Okay, so Churchill revisionism and criticism has been going on ever since he was alive.
Ever since he was about 30. I think the first attack on him was in a biography, was written when he was about 30 years old. So yes, this has been going on for over a century.
Now, in the last 15, 20 years, you can go back even further, most of the criticism of Winston Churchill has come from the left, that he is a racist, that he is a coloniser, that he's a supporter of the British Empire, that he supported famines in India and things like that. But in very recent years, a lot of the criticism has come from the right. Why do you think that is?
Because a lot of the people who are listening to these revisionist historians have not been taught history properly. You know, they aren't willing to really see history in an objective way. They want history to fit into preconceived political and ideological positions, which it simply doesn't do.
Now, I think one of the most pertinent criticisms of Winston Churchill is that he basically gave away too much to the Americans, whether this was for the 50 battleships that the Americans gave us in return for control over some of our bases overseas, one of which was only used in combat in an operation in France. He gave away all of our scientific research, our gold reserves, and this basically bankrupted Britain after the Second World War. Do you think there's any legitimate criticism there where he's given away too much to the Americans?
No, the 50 destroyers were used, but they weren't used in direct operations. They were used to take the place of other destroyers that were used in operations. You know, it was an amazing deal, frankly, to have got 50 destroyers at that stage of the Second World War. 1 year in was great. As far as the gold reserve were concerned, we were going to be bankrupt. We were going to be broke, and if it hadn't been for the American loan that kept us solvent at the end of the war and at the beginning of the post-war period, we would have been actually bankrupt. So he was right to call Lend-Lease the most unsordid act. And there's a third thing that you mentioned as well.
The scientific research.
The scientific research. That was entirely in order to create the atomic bomb, which ended the Second World War. And we couldn't possibly have expected the United States to have spent that amount of money at Los Alamos and not give our brain power to try to defeat the Japanese. We'd been attacked by the Japanese as well, of course, and actually had lost just as much land to the Japanese as the Americans had. So it wasn't a one-way street. It was something that, issue by issue, you can totally understand why we did what we did.
People like Darrell Cooper and others have argued that Churchill was a warmonger, that in the 1930s he wanted war, he encouraged the Second World War to happen, and he was crucial in keeping the war going. How do you respond to this criticism that he was a warmonger?
Well, of course, a lot of people did die in the Second World War, and there was a way of avoiding it. You could have just surrendered to Hitler, very straightforwardly. You could have let him have Czechoslovakia, let him have Poland, let him have Norway and Denmark and France and Belgium and Luxembourg and Holland. Easy. End of the war. But no. Ultimately, actually, that would have been so shameful, so dishonourable, and so disastrous for Britain's position in the long term to have allowed him to have completely dominated the whole of Europe, that we would have had to have stayed an armed camp forever. If he had gone into Russia, he could well have defeated Russia. If he hadn't gone into Russia, he could have held back until the nuclear bomb was discovered, and then we'd have been in an even worse position. The idea that the Second World War was Winston Churchill's fault, or was avoidable, considering the ambitions, the clear ambitions that Adolf Hitler had, I think is psychotic.
Now, there has been lots of revisionism, not just of Churchill, but also of Neville Chamberlain. Some historians today argue that Chamberlain's hands were essentially tied in the 1930s due to public opinion. People didn't want to go to war. It was like 90% of the public in Britain didn't want to go to war. Because of the tragedy of the First World War, they didn't want to see the repeated horror and mass deaths in the trenches. And Winston Churchill was very kind to Chamberlain when he died of cancer during the Second World War. But during his memoirs and his books describing the Second World War, Churchill was vicious in his attacks on Neville Chamberlain. Do you agree or accept the criticisms or the revisionism around Neville Chamberlain?
No, because Chamberlain thought that he had actually bought off peace in Munich in 1938. He hated being forced into the guarantee to Poland in 1939. He was unbelievably vain in thinking that he was able to persuade Hitler onto a peaceful path. He was essentially muscled into the stance that we adopted by 1939. It was not something that he ever wanted himself. He truly believed in appeasement. It wasn't just a realpolitik move because he was unable to get public opinion round. The job of a Prime Minister is to create public opinion and to nudge public opinion, push it, and he did none of those things.
Do you agree with Douglas Murray that people like Joe Rogan are hosting far too many of the revisionists on Winston Churchill and not the people who are defending him? And would you accept to go on Joe Rogan's podcast?
Yeah, I've already said, of course I go on Joe Rogan, and I have not been asked. And I'd love to debate Darrell Cooper, because Darrell Cooper's facts are unbelievably wrong on so many levels. And he blames Winston Churchill for the outbreak of the Second World War when Winston Churchill was actually in opposition. He wasn't Prime Minister. There are any number of factual errors that what's his name? Cooper. Sorry, not Cooper. What's the other chap called?
Dave Smith? Rogan?
No. The other right-wing broadcaster who used to be on Fox and now
Tucker.
Tucker Carlson. Yeah. Just the other day, in a conversation with Piers Morgan, Tucker Carlson implied that Hitler had no plans ever to invade England. I mean, we have the actual plans. It's all sort of set out in black and white. They'd worked out which beaches they were going to land on. They'd worked out who they were going to arrest. They had profound plans for the whole of the Operation Sea Lion, as it was called. The sheer ignorance of some of these revisionist people beggars belief.
I haven't seen the clip about Tucker Carlson, but I'm going to offer a mild defence. Hitler didn't have serious plans to invade England before the Second World War began, before England declared war on Germany because of the invasion of Poland.
That's not what he said. He said never had plans to invade England.
Fair enough. I want to ask about Pat Buchanan, because I said earlier that...
By the way, I think you might be wrong about that, because even in 1938 they set up the plan to arrest 3,820 British people, and they wouldn't have been able to do that without an invasion.
He was always saying that he wanted peace with the British Empire, and that I don't know if we could believe him or not, but...
Absolutely. Yeah. If you're going to believe Adolf Hitler, you're as bad as Joseph Stalin.
Pat Buchanan. So I said earlier that this recent criticism has been from the right, but actually Buchanan has been attacking Churchill for a long time. And you did a fantastic debate with him, I don't know when it was, 20 years ago, something like that. So what do you make of the Pat Buchanan wing of politics? I guess this has been going on for longer than I surmised.
I think that there's a really profoundly unpleasant strain in this new sort of ultra MAGA stance that comes a lot from the Patrick Buchanan stance. And it's not just the isolationism. Of course, it's perfectly reasonable for the United States to be isolationist if it wants to. It's the anti-Semitism that I think is lurking behind a great deal of this. Because essentially what these people are saying is that that Hitler was essentially another German statesman, not that different from other German statesmen who you could get along with, who you shouldn't go to war against. And I think any of those people who think that have got to recognise that the anti-Semitism of Adolf Hitler, his desire to annihilate the Jewish race in Israel, in Europe, which they will later, the more sophisticated of them, will claim only started after the war began and wasn't part of Hitler's worldview, must recognise that of course it always was part of Hitler's worldview. And the idea that you can just ignore that aspect of the Second World War strikes me as a very sinister way to look at history.
Now, I think the motivation behind many of the attacks on Churchill, and even whether the Second World War was justified, come from people on the right who are nationalists, who are conservatives, and who see the Second World War as linking their ideology, nationalist conservatism, with Nazism and the Holocaust. They see the Second World War as resulting in globalism, in liberalism, in the UN, in FDR, and all of this stuff. So do you understand that kind of criticism of Churchill from that perspective, that look, it's tying legitimate ideas of conservatism and nationalism with Nazism?
I think that, of course, the world does move on from the Second World War. It was 80 years ago, so you're bound to have moved on. But what it does do is tell you a series of moral stories about the way democracies should treat totalitarianism, for example, which I think they still pertain, and we're in danger of forgetting them. And I think with regard, a classic example obviously being Ukraine and Russia, to just equate Ukraine and Russia entirely morally equal, which is what a lot of these people would like to do, I think ignores some of the most important lessons of the Second World War, which is that an unprovoked attack by a totalitarian state on its neighbour, especially a neighbour that isn't totalitarian, is something that the whole of the rest of the world should worry about.
But what about the point that conservatism and nationalism have been tied with Nazism unfairly and cynically?
Utterly brilliant by the left, considering that actually Adolf Hitler was a populist, that the socialism in National Socialism actually meant something to him, and that true conservatives, Tory conservatives, are disgusted by Adolf Hitler and fascism and totalitarianism just as much as anybody on the left. It's been an absolute brilliant sort of blackening of the right, and especially the centre-right, Thatcherite right, Reaganite right, to ever be tarnished with that kind of brush. But today, I do sort of wonder and worry about some of this ultra MAGA thinking, because it strikes me that when you get people who hate Winston Churchill hatred, which one has automatically assumed will come from the left, and when it comes from the ultra right, then I start to doubt whether or not these people are genuinely interested in democracy.
Yeah, you talk about ultra MAGA. I think that Churchill's bust was reinstated into the White House by Trump, so it doesn't... If he is ultra MAGA, I don't know. But,
no, he's not. He's not. Trump is nothing like... Trump likes Churchill. Trump is not anything like as bad as Darryl Cooper or some of his other sort of weirder supporters.
It's also ironic that in the 1930s, it was those on the left who perhaps were most against rearmament before the Second World War.
Well, I wouldn't say most against. They were opposed to it. That's another thing that the left have managed to get us to forget, that in fact the Labour Party was opposed to rearmament up until April 1939, and its leader, George Lansbury, was an out-and-out pacifist up until 1935. You know, it is interesting. This is, maybe I'm sounding a bit revisionist here, but we do need to look again at what the left and the Labour Party were saying about appeasement.
Was FDR the lesser of Winston Churchill?
No. FDR was a giant of the 20th century. He was the person who, against the advice of George Marshall and various other, Admiral King, various other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, insisted on there not being an over-hasty return to the continent, but at the same time he supported the Germany First policy, which was very counterintuitive. You know, in December 1941, you've been attacked in the Pacific by the Japanese, and yet you spend 70% of American resources fighting the Germans in the Atlantic. I mean, this is a counterintuitive and genius act of statecraft. The big issue that I think a lot of people worry about with regard to FDR is Yalta, and the fact that he allowed Poland and East Germany to fall into the Soviet maw. And some people sort of claim that Winston Churchill didn't want that. But actually, when you look at what was said at Yalta, both of them essentially were tricked by Stalin's lies, promising the independence and integrity of Poland, and at the same time obviously knowing that there were millions of Red Army boots on the ground and that there was absolutely nothing practically that the Americans or British Canadians could have done about the freedom of Poland and Eastern Europe anyway. They tried their best in October 1944 in the notorious Percentages Agreement to save Greece, and they managed to. But the rest of it was gone.
But FDR was surrounded by communist and communist sympathisers in the 1930s. Some people even think Harry Hopkins may have been a Soviet spy. That's contentious.
totally rubbish. I mean, that's not contentious.
Well,
that's absolute balls.
Okay, maybe.
And when you say surrounded, Alger Hiss was an incredibly minor figure. So was Harry Dexter White. These are not his primary advisors. Yes, they were communists and they were Russian spies and so on, but they weren't his closest advisors by any means.
But what about the fact that FDR did want to dismantle the British Empire and other European empires? He was fooled by Joseph Stalin. He refused to meet with Churchill separately before Yalta. So the argument is that actually FDR's post-war policy was incredibly myopic, incredibly America-focused, and actually favoured Stalin over the British Empire.
Yeah, he put American national interests first. That's his job. That's what he's paid to do.
He was against the British Empire, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and he wasn't. If he'd been British Prime Minister and was against the British Empire, then I'd criticise him. But he's the American president, and he recognises that the rest of the century is going to be the American century. They didn't put anything like as much pressure on us to get rid of India, for example, which was the crown jewels of the British Empire, that as people think. We deliberately gave that away. A Labour government gave India away. It wasn't under pressure from the United States. It was the fact that we were broke after 5-6 years of war. We were the only country, the British Empire, to have fought the war from the very beginning to the very end. And of course it would completely exhaust our resources. We couldn't hold on to the British Empire after the Second World War. This was not FDR's fault. This is the fact that we did something of untarnishable glory, which is to destroy Nazism.
You've answered this question many times before. I'm going to ask again, though. What is the most potent criticism of Churchill?
In the Second World War?
Yeah.
That he allowed the HMS Repulse and the Prince of Wales to go off without proper air cover to Singapore. That was a catastrophe. He probably should have evacuated Tobruk earlier. He was maybe made a mistake with regard to the steel production for bombers as opposed to submarines in 1943. These are mistakes anyone could have made. Frankly, he wasn't the only person in deciding, bomber production and so on. That was a chief of staff's decision and the defence committee of the cabinet and so on. But no, nobody pretends that this man made no mistakes whatsoever. It would have been impossible in the thousands of decisions that he was taking not to have made some mistakes. But when it comes to getting the big things right, Winston Churchill has an extraordinary record. He was the person who came up with the overall strategic plan for the Western Allies, and he sold it to the Americans. He stopped the Americans from crossing over the Channel at a time when the Germans could have won, and waited and held back until we had the supplies, had the air cover, won the Battle of Atlantic, and were able to pull off this extraordinary victory.
Do you think that Britain is currently going through a kind of historical amnesia?
Yes, we are. And it's tragic, and the reason is that we're not teaching enough proper history in our schools. There's a very good paper that Policy Exchange put out recently about all this. We still seem to be sort of caught in a 1960s time warp where we're feeling guilty about absolutely everything in our history, whereas there is so much in our history that we ought to be proud of.
Is there a danger of us applying today's moral standards to historical figures of the past?
We're constantly doing that, and it doesn't make any sense. It's ahistorical. You might as well criticise Oliver Cromwell for not supporting socialised medicine. It doesn't make no sense whatsoever.
So as a man who's written many biographies of great men of history, what do you think makes a great leader? Foresight is pretty important. The ability, even if you don't necessarily have charisma, to sell the idea to people that what you're asking them to do
is something that will be recognised by history, that people aren't just living their own lives out, they're in fact doing something that people in the future will look up to and admire. I think that it's interesting. I don't think necessarily, for all that I love Winston Churchill, oratory is central, really. I don't think you need a sense of humour, particularly. I don't think you need to be a good person morally, either. There are lots of great leaders who don't have any of those things, but still are admirable. And so it's a difficult thing, leadership. It's a bit like nuclear fission or the sea. You know, it's neither good nor, or the internet. You know, it's neither good nor bad. It has great capacity for positive and negative things, leadership, and it's not necessarily something that can be easily taught either. But yeah, it's a strange alchemy.
Is Donald Trump a great man of history, and are there any other great men alive today?
It'll be interesting to see with regard to Trump in 50 years' time or so, because if everything that he does ends with the midterms and is then, because he actually hasn't passed that many bills, he's signed a lot of executive orders. If an incoming president just signs executive orders that negate all of his, it'll essentially be two years plus the previous 4 years, of course, which seem to be a very different kind of thing. Trump 1 and Trump 2 seem to be extremely different. So he'll be written about in history, of course he will, but whether or not he's going to be written about in that obsessive way that Richard Nixon is written about, or whether or not he's going to be written about like, I don't know, Cleveland or Harrison, you know, where you're lucky to get one biography a decade, if that, is still very much up in the air.
But aren't you being a bit myopic and short-sighted just looking at legislative victories or failures? Trump has survived assassination attempts to put him in prison. He has shaped the last decade of American politics, and he is perhaps the most recognisable, the most well-known man alive on the planet today. So therefore he already is a great man of history.
I don't think so, no, because proper historians look at what somebody has achieved rather than just who they were. You can have people who've lived sort of very exciting and interesting lives, but in order to be admired by history, actually one of the sad things is, in order to be really noticed in history, you pretty much have to have a war, and Trump is by his own, volition, trying to get out of wars and stop wars and end wars. So I'm not sure that he is going to be that interesting to historians in sort of 50 years' time.
Are there any great men alive today? I'm assuming you might mention Zelensky.
Very much. I've mentioned Vladimir Zelensky. Yes, he is a giant of his, not just of his own country and his own area, but of his own time. I think those, and there is somebody who has had a war. Wow, what a war! It's impossible, obviously, at this stage to know whether or not he's going to be victorious or defeated. But I think either way, his responses, of course, in the February of 2022 and since, will make him go down as a great leader.
How important is history in shaping a nation's confidence and national story?
I think it's central, but the problem is that every country has its own creation myth. We're about to see the United States talk about its creation myth for the 250th anniversary of 1776 next year, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing too. Every country has it, but the important thing is that the myth should be grounded in fact. It shouldn't be just complete legend and invention. It does need to have something that is historically accurate and evidentially based. So let's see how that works out.
Now, you mentioned George III and the American Revolution. I actually live in America now, and your book is the only book that I've read about that period of history, which some Americans find infuriating. What are the great myths about the American Revolution?
Well, again, there are lots of them. I think the greatest one is that the Declaration of Independence, which was a straightforward propaganda document, beautifully written, Shakespearean prose, wonderful phrases from Thomas Jefferson. But actually, when you look at the list of 28 things that George III was supposed to have done, making him out to be an evil tyrant. In fact, there were only two that justified what Jefferson was saying about him. But those two were the key ones. Taxation is central to a nation, and we had we didn't have the sovereign right to tax if they didn't want us to, and frankly, by 1770s, America had enough wherewithal to be an independent country, and so it took its independence, and well done it. But the idea that they were taking independence from a monstrous, tyrannical, vicious, evil English regime is complete bunkum.
Quite right. Are there figures from history who have been unfairly forgotten or maligned?
Well, George III, of course, is a classic example of being maligned. He's not forgotten because he's still thought of in America as being this evil tyrant. But people come in and out of history all the time. I'm writing a book about Napoleon and his marshals. He had 26 marshals. People only really know about 5 or 6 of them, and so there are another 19 or 20 who I'm looking forward to introducing to a expectant public.
I'm actually trying to wink at you about Lord Salisbury. I want you to talk about one of your first books.
One great figure of the past who seems to have been forgotten largely is the third Marquess of Salisbury, who was Prime Minister between 1885 and 1902 in Great Britain, Queen Victoria's last Prime Minister. And he was a giant, both an intellectual giant for his concept of Toryism, and also a giant on the world stage because of his way of diplomatically ensuring that nations got on, that we didn't go to war in his period. If he'd lived an extra 10 years and been Prime Minister for another 10 years, I think he'd have warded off the First World War. And he was somebody who was funny, extremely witty, in a mordant, very Tory way. High irony was his métier. I think that it would have been a very good thing if, instead of writing a 900-page biography of him, I'd written a 400-page one, and maybe more people would have appreciated him.
What is the one historical misconception that you most wish that the public would unlearn?
Oh, that this Bengal famine was Winston Churchill's fault. What absolute rubbish that is. A terrible cyclone hit Bengal in the October of 1942. It destroyed the rail and road links by which food naturally came in. There were Indian governments, in fact, in Bengal that held up the provision of cheap food, even if they physically could get it in. The Japanese were in the Bay of Bengal preventing rice and other crops from being brought in, and they'd invaded the 3 places Malaya and Burma and Thailand, where food historically had been brought in. The idea that Winston Churchill deliberately wanted 3 million Indians to starve to death is absolute rot, and I do wish that a few more people actually read the primary sources and read my book on the subject and so on, and recognise that this is just essentially a horrible libel on him.
Thank you so much, Andrew Roberts, for joining us.